We've got Joe Long, 22. Thank you for patiently waiting while I talk to that Canadian son of a bitch. What you got?
No problem. Can you hear me?
Yep,
Yeah. So, obviously, my name's Joe. What's your name?
Jaaron.
Jaaron.
Yep.
All right. Nice to meet you, Jaaron.
Yep.
Um, I'm Christian.
Okay.
Just to put that out there, I have a number of different problems with some things that you have said. I just want to get your
Some
thoughts on
things
some of
I've
those
said
things. Some things that you've said, just listening to you.
about Canada.
Ignatius,
Oh,
not about not about Canada. I disagree with nothing you've said about Canada. Um, Ignatius, number one, biblical canon, number two, and then obviously the claim that Jesus and Paul never existed. I have a pretty big problem with as well. I don't know which one of those you think we should tackle first, but
whichever one you'd like.
whichever one you want from me. Uh, I guess my question is, what is your evidence that, or I guess what question are you really asking? Are you asking someone to prove that Jesus and Paul never existed? Are you
I
asking
mean,
for
if you've got
evidence
any
that
evidence they did
that they
exist, that'd be
existed?
pretty good. We can go over it. Yeah, and see if it's
So
actually any
I
good.
guess that's where I'm coming from, is the fact that you can't really prove this, right? It's all evidence based, so you can't really, I
Sure.
can
Well, what
prove that I'm
evidence do you
talking
have?
to you right now,
Yeah.
right?
Well, prove
Uh,
us wrong is a pretty common phrase. I think it was first really made huge by like the little stand that Steven Crowder had and everything like that. So I mean,
well,
I get
that's
what you're
changed my
saying. I
mind,
get
but
what you well,
yes.
change my mind, prove us wrong, that kind of thing. Like yeah, that's changed my mind. It was, but like it's a pretty common phrase that would be used a lot there. So I mean, I understand that like proof, maybe depending on how you use the term, it could be like 100% evidence or something like that. But I mean, then you can get all philosophical and say that you can't prove anything. In which case, okay, but sure.
So
I
we're
mean, I
talking
get
about
it, but I mean,
obviously
this,
evidence, right?
yeah, we're
Evidence.
obviously talking about evidence and whether or not it is good evidence to suggest that these people actually did exist in their natural form in the way that the New Testament presents them.
Sure. Uh, so I'm guessing that you would reject the idea that Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John good evidence for the existence of Jesus, and that Paul's letters are
I
evidence
mean,
for Paul's existence.
you can use them if you want, but like, how did you determine they were good evidence? Like, I mean, I wouldn't say
Well,
that they
they're
would be, but I mean,
that's I guess why I'm asking is, why would you not consider those to be good evidence?
there's no evidence that they were even written in the first century, so I don't even
I mean,
consider them to be some.
most biblical scholars would date John as being the last gospel, Mark
Mm-hmm.
being the first gospel,
Yep.
all of them being written prior to the 70s. I think John is most
All of
often
them
placed
written
around.
prior to the 70s?
That's what
No,
most biblical scholars would place them.
no, that's not even
But
remotely
you can't
close to
just say
correct.
no.
No, John
That's
is generally
absolutely
thought to be
true.
90 to 110, so no.
Said from who? According to who?
The majority of scholars are you
That's
specifically choosing like here? What I'm gonna do really fast is I'm just gonna just Google it really fast. When was John written? Between 85 and 90 there. Most scholars, you have some conservative historians argue for an earlier window of 64 to 70. Like most people would put it later. The scholarly
all right.
consensus right here, it
Let's go
says
with
scholarly
85 and 90.
consensus, modern theologians and historians typically place authorship between 90 and 110, often concluding that it was composed by Johannine community, preserving the teachings of Apostle John. Yeah, so I mean, no, dude. The majority
Yeah,
of
so we'll
scholars
put
do
an
not put
85 and
all
90.
four of them prior to 70. That's dog shit apologetics.
Well, okay, well then all four of them prior to 90.
Whatever you want to say. I don't care how many people say it. I care about the evidence that they present. What evidence do they present that it's actually written at that point?
Well, I honestly would agree with those of them that are talking about 70.
It doesn't
For
matter. What's your
John,
evidence for it?
my evidence for it is that John does not mention the fall of the temple. The
John
fall of
does
the temple
mention the fall of
happens.
the temple. He
He doesn't
mentions.
mention the fall of the temple as being an event that already happened. He mentions it as a prophecy, as it's going to happen. It
Okay.
hasn't happened yet. So that's
Okay.
the evidence for John being before 70. That's my evidence.
Right.
And obviously, John is the last of the written gospels. So
Mm.
all of them, from my opinion, that's my evidence. You asked for evidence, would be
That's not
dated before
evidence.
70.
That's not evidence that something, or it's not good evidence that something is actually written at that point in time. Can you and I write a story about? Can you write a story right now about the Civil War?
Yes.
Okay. Does that mean that you wrote it in 1860s?
What? No.
Is that okay? Yeah, that's how that works, man. And if your book doesn't mention 9/11, I guess it wasn't written before 2001. That's stupid
But
as
he's
shit,
talking. No, that's not what that means. He's
no,
talking about the fall of the temple as an event to come.
I
not
understand,
an event that has already happened.
But listen, if this is written in the 2nd century by someone who isn't Jewish, then they don't give a shit about whether or not the temple was
What's
destroyed.
the evidence that it's written in the 2nd century by someone who's not Jewish?
Are you ready for this? Because now
I'm
you're
ready.
asking me. Okay, so all right. So John is the last of the 4 canonical gospels, correct?
Yes.
Okay, so John has to come after Luke, correct?
I would argue yes.
Okay.
If it's last,
Sweet.
it has to come after another one, yes.
Sweet. All right. So Luke, then all that means is that I have to show you that Luke comes after 144. And we can very clearly see that because are you familiar with Marcion at all?
Yes, I'm familiar with Marcion, yes.
Okay. So with Marcion, we actually have a gospel that is sometimes called Evangelion, the Gospel of Marcion,
Yes.
Gospel of the Lord, just Gospel in Greek. All right.
Yes,
Are you
it's
familiar with what
irrelevant.
Irenaeus, Tertullian, and Origen said about Marcion's Evangelion and its connection to Luke?
Go for it.
I'm asking you, are you familiar with it?
What Ignatius had to say about Marcion?
No, Irenaeus, Tertullian, and Origen had to say about Marcion's Gospel Evangelion.
No.
Okay. So what they said was that this gospel was created by Marcion taking what's called a penknife, or they called it a penknife, to the Gospel of Luke and removing certain parts in order to make their
The
gospel.
bulk of Luke, there's a bulk of Luke that is
Because
found in the
words that are found in
Evangelion,
the Gospel of
and
Luke
that
are
the
same as,
some of the church
Marcion's
fathers
gospel, but Marcion's gospel is small,
worked with and
right?
described,
So
but they were
said
working
that
with
we
it
took
in
the
what do you
Gospel
say,
of Luke around
144?
earlier and removed
No,
parts. Evangelion comes out in 144. The later church fathers, Tertullian, Origen, and Irenaeus, write about this gospel Evangelion and what it had in it, like what its content was, their gospel starting in about 180 all the way to 240.
So how do we know it comes out in 144?
The gospel because Justin Martyr is actually who says that he's alive at the same time as Marcion, and he actually starts saying that he was active there at the beginning of the 40s or the 140s, and then Irenaeus says that it came out about the same time. So they're talking about a text that they have, and they're talking about a person that just was alive and active prior to them. Justin Martyr is a contemporary of Marcion and says that literary analysis, or would you like just simply a verse?
Okay, so now, so we don't beg the question between me being correct and you being correct. Let's try to make it as neutral as possible.
The Gospel of Luke.
To this statement that you're making this claim that what was in Luke, a large bulk of what was in Luke was also in this the Evangelion, and Justin Martyr had the Evangelion.
Take a look. Yeah, Justin Martyr doesn't say
is that right?
Evangelion. No, that's Irenaeus, Tertullian.
Okay.
You see that it starts Justin Martyr just says
but
he's
they,
alive at the same time as Marcion, who publishes like fucking like.
So Justin Martyr
in verse 14, he goes over to Galilee.
States that Marcion published it, and while he was alive.
Justin Martyr says that Marcion is still active
from the scroll,
even though
Isaiah,
he's
blah, blah,
kind of
blah, blah,
old,
he
but
reads
he's
and
still
everybody's
active
like, oh
there
my God,
in
it's
the
so great.
150s when he's
So
writing.
it says in verse 22.
But he doesn't
says,
say
"All
that
spoke well of
Marcion
him
published
and were
the
amazed at
Evangelion?
gracious
No,
words that
he
came from
doesn't.
his
He
mouth."
doesn't
They said,
mention it.
"Is
Well, he
this
may
not
mention it, but he
Joseph's
doesn't
son?"
quote it. That's
This
not how we
is the
reconstruct
most
it.
damning verse in all of the
Okay,
Gospel
so
of Luke, even though it looks
I thought you were so where do you get the where do you get the 144 dating?
Dr. Curie.
No, the 144 dating of the
Do
event.
here
Evangelion.
because that's when
also
he
in
would have
your
been active.
hometown,
According
the
to
things that
the
we have
story
heard
as
you
well,
did
he
at
shows up
Capernaum.
in Rome
In other
in the
words,
late 130s
you
and
want me
ends
to
up
do
getting
miracles,
kicked out
so I
of the
bet
church in
next
Rome
you're
around
gonna
that
want me
time.
to do miracles like
Irenaeus, I
at
believe, is the
Capernaum.
one who says that
Makes
he
sense?
is kicked out of Rome,
Yes.
excommunicated from the church in
Here
Rome
is
in
the
the
problem.
144, and that's when he publishes.
He has not
That's
been to
what
Capernaum
Irenaeus-
So
yet.
it's kind of like
Let him
an
go to
inference
Capernaum
from
until
a few
verse
facts.
31.
The
He's
fact
also never
that
done any
he
miracles
lived during
yet.
this
He's
time,
not doing any
that
miracles
Justin
until he goes to
Martyr
Capernaum.
says he
And we have
lived
the man
and-
that comes
and-
from Spirit in
and we
verse
also
31.
have people talking about
This
when he
line
published.
right here
We
is
also have a
completely
contemporary
out of order.
We also have a
And
contemporary of him.
it is
who's
only
saying
found
he's
in
still
two
active
Gospels.
in the
It
150s.
is not found in Matthew. It is not found in Mark.
Okay.
It's not found in John. It is
So-
found in Luke.
So far,
nevertheless,
we
even
agree
if
with
you
this.
want to move it from
According to
140,
literally
all
at best
three
you can move it to like
of
the 130s or
all
something.
three
Like it
of
wouldn't really
the,
do too terribly much.
Writers who
You could
quote
maybe
from
move it
when
later to
talking
the
shit
150s
about
if you
Marcion.
wanted
This
that,
is
but
Tertullian,
roughly 144
Origen, and
is the
Irenaeus.
best guess that we have.
They said that it started off
Correct.
Jesus
So I'm
was
just
sending it
making
out
sure
of
I
heaven
understand the argument. So
into Capernaum in verse 1.
a large
that
bulk of what is in
miracle
Luke
that is
is
talked about
also
in
in the
Luke 4.
Evangelion.
And then
Yes.
I got that
going
right?
to Nazareth.
Okay.
where he goes
Marcion
to the synagogue,
wrote the Evangelon,
correct?
correct?
Scroll of, or reads from the
He
scroll of
publishes
Isaiah.
it.
Everybody's really,
Marcion
got big old boners because he's talking
publishes it,
so
so he
nicely
may
and
not
everything.
have written it.
And then he says
Is
that
that what
line.
you're saying?
I believe
It is
that
in
actually his
the
students
correct
themselves,
position
but nevertheless,
in the
sure,
Gospel
he publishes
of
it. He's
Marcion.
the first person
In
to mention it. He
Evangeline, it
publishes
is in
there
position.
in
It is in the
144
correct spot.
How are you determining that that
Wow,
is
so
in the
that's
correct
a
position?
very specific
Because he's been to
distinction, what you just
Capernaum and
said.
did
Yeah, you
miracles,
corrected
and then
me
he
on
says,
that. So
I
you're
bet
saying
you
he
want me to do
published it,
miracles
but
like I did in
didn't
Capernaum.
write it.
He doesn't do that until later on. This section here
Okay, so who and
is
you
the
think his
section that all
students wrote it?
Tertullian, Origen,
Most
and
likely, yes,
Irenaeus
because
place
we
at
see
the
multiple
beginning
authors, like, within the
of
text, but
Evangeline.
that's only within the
Evangeline
text,
has
so
it
it's kind of
correctly.
difficult to actually tell.
What they
He
didn't
wrote
like,
it,
the
we
author
don't-
of
we
Luke,
don't really know
didn't
who
like
wrote
the
it.
idea that Jesus descends out of heaven as
Okay,
a
so we
fully grown
don't-
man
we don't
and
have
just
evidence
starts
of who
preaching
wrote
there.
it.
They
Otherwise,
opted
you would
to
make that
copy
stronger claim.
Matthew for
Yeah,
Luke 2
well, I
for
mean,
a birth
obviously no
story,
one
or
else
come up
from
with a birth
Christianity
story
would
of their
know
own,
because they
a
thought
different
that he was
version
a
from
heretic,
Matthew, but it doesn't matter.
okay.
The point is, they
Well,
put it in
and
Luke
when you
2.
were in
Luke
the
1
school
talks
of
about the
thought,
birth of, or the
anything that
forthcoming
was
birth
written,
of
didn't matter who it was
John the
by,
Baptist.
it would
Luke
always be
3
attributed
talks about how
to
John the
whoever
Baptist
school of
ministry
thought it
starts,
was.
and then says
Right.
the genealogy
So, I
of
mean-
So
Jesus.
would you say
And then
Would
chapter
you
4,
say
as we
that
just showed,
there's
is the
a
first chapter
portion-
that they start
so when you
utilizing
say what's
the
in Luke is
gospel
in
from
the
Marcion
Evangeline,
in.
are you
It's
saying
roughly chapters 4
that
through
the
22
exact
that
thing
we
that is in
get
Luke is in the Evangeline?
a separate
So what contradicts?
separate author in.
100%
Okay.
So I'm a
Evangeline is
data
actually in
scientist,
Luke.
and when analyzing
So
the
the
Gospel of
portion
Luke
of the
as well as
Evangeline that
Acts, like all
contradicts,
put together there,
Christians,
actually
like you just
tell
said, would not
that
be
there
the
is
portion that's in
a
Luke.
let me see
No,
here.
I mean, Luke takes it.
So
and then adds
we can
to
actually
it.
get this
That's what
thing.
I'm
It is called a
saying. He adds to
dendrogram.
it to
Right,
try to
so-
change
so-
the
Go ahead
theology.
and bring this up here.
Right. So the portion that
This
in
is
both
a graph.
Evangeline
It is kind
and
of
in
like
Luke
it's kind of like a
is
family tree.
consistent
And the
with
way that it
Christian
works
theology.
Because
Meaning
is
that
it
Christians
analyzes
accept
text and then
Luke.
puts them into different
Right. So,
different like
so there is
branches and
something
whatnot.
else that
So
is in
whenever
the
we take a look at
Evangeline that is
4 chapters of
inconsistent
Acts and
with
4
Christian
chapters of Luke
theology. That's
all
what
at the
you're
same
saying.
time in order
No,
to
it's
get
a lack of something in
meet certain standards that
Evangeline
people on the
that is
internet have said that we need to meet and
with,
stuff like that, which is dumb and not required, but we did it anyways.
Okay,
So whenever we
so
do this,
there-
we see
so
that
it's
all of
missing
Acts comes
something
up
that's
as
in the
one
Gospels.
author
The
because it
Evangeline is
was.
missing
There's
that.
slight
And
additions,
the
there's
beginning
slight
of Luke,
additions
as
to
well as
text,
the last
including
chapter of
the
Luke,
chapters at the beginning
always
and the
comes
end,
up with
in
this
order to
particular
change the
group.
theology.
Roughly, depending on how you cut
Okay,
it, sometimes we can
so-
cut it into
so
1
we
chapter
agree
at a time,
that
2, 3,
Marcion
or even like this, 4
published,
chapters
but we
at a
don't know
time.
who wrote the Evangeline.
Every
We
single
know that
time, we will have a
Luke
completely
from
different
chapter
author
4 to
for the
time
bulk
is
of
the
Luke,
thing,
roughly chapters
because
4 through
Marcion is the one
22,
who
that will
publishes
come
it,
up
and
separate
the
from
Christians
anything in
accuse him of
Acts,
coming
as
out.
well as the beginning of Luke and the end of Luke.
Okay, so
That is because of the
so it's
fact
published
that
around
they
this time. We don't
utilize
know who
an
the author
earlier
is,
text.
but it
An
is
earlier
the,
text is utilized. If
Evangeline and
Marcion
Luke
took
have the exact
from the
same
Gospel
material.
of Luke
But you said there were edits, so
and
could it be
just
the exact
took
same
pieces
that there
out
were
of it,
edits?
all of Luke should come up as
What?
one
No,
author.
I'm saying
It
the
should
exact
also be
material that is in
interspersed and
Evangeline
all
is in
intermingled
Luke.
and
That's
tied
all
up
I'm
with
saying.
the rest of
Okay,
Acts.
okay. So when you
right?
said you mentioned
But it's
edits
not.
a second ago, so I
All
was
of
thinking
Acts
you were saying
always comes up as
something
one
changed.
author, and that
It is
same author
changed
wrote the
in the
beginning
Gospel
and
of
the end of Luke. But the bulk
Oh,
of
so
Luke
Luke-
from
so
4
Luke
to
has
22
edits.
roughly is
Okay, so
a
I'm
completely
trying to
separate
tell
author.
you that they
And
literally
all
took
the
Evangeline
information
and added to
that
it.
is in chapters
That's what
4
I
through
mean by
22 with
edits.
only slight edits every once in a
Okay,
while
now you
is
now,
found
if you're
in
trying
Marcion's
to
Evangeline, as Tertullian,
argue
Origen, and Irenaeus
that
all claim
Luke
and cite.
was stolen
So
from the
what
or
I'm saying
borrowed,
here
or however you
is
want to
that
say,
that's
copied from
exactly what
Evangeline.
happened. Marcion came out in
The
144
statement that
with
They
Evangeline.
added
And then later
to
on,
Luke
as his followers
begs the
claim,
question.
and Irenaeus even admits
because
they
that
claim,
assumes that
someone
Luke borrowed
added
from
to that
Evangeline.
text
But that's
and
neither
then
here, that's
decided
neither here nor
to
there. What-
call it the Gospel of Luke,
So your
and then
argument
they
seems to
wrote
be
Acts later.
the
Both
Evangeline
Acts and Luke both are
has
addressed to Theophilus.
identical
There are
material.
2 people named Theophilus in the 150s and
We
160s.
have writers who
Eusebius
say
confirms that somebody in the
that
150s was
Marcion
called
wrote or published the
Theophilus, and he
Evangeline.
was a well-revered person.
And then you
And
want to
Theophilus of
conclude
Antioch
from
was a
that
bishop
in the 160s.
therefore Luke
This is
borrowed
around the
from
time
Evangeline.
that we would say that the Gospel of Luke is written, and it's
Is that your
specifically
argument?
addressed to them.
Okay, so let's fill that out.
What this
because-
is. It literally says
Okay,
at
so
the very
fill that out. Show
beginning
me what I'm missing.
that multiple
So
people
the
have
argument
attempted
from
to write a
Irenaeus,
gospel,
Tertullian, and Origen
and
is that
this person knows
Marcion
from the
took
very
Luke
start
and took
how
pieces
to
out
actually
of
put
it.
it together,
But
and so they're
they
sending it
admit
to
that the
Theophilus.
other
We
version
can
of this, the
tell
opposite,
that this
the
is something
inverse,
that is actually
was claimed
from
by the,
or
Marcionites,
utilizing
followers of
Evangeline.
Marcion,
We
his
can tell.
students. They said that their gospel came out first, and someone came
Interesting.
added to it.
I mean, I disagree.
So it's
Um,
either Evangeline took
What do you
from
disagree
Luke,
with?
like, took pieces out of
And
Luke,
what kind of evidence would you?
or Evangeline
I've
came
presented
first
my
and
evidence
added to
for
it.
why
Yeah.
it comes after
Added to
144.
it in order to
Do you
make it.
have any mention
That-
of the
that's-
Gospel of
there's only
Luke prior to
two options
144?
here.
And considering the fact that
Any.
we look into the text,
I mean, would you take an early church father quoting Luke as evidence to it prior to 144?
I want you to point to any church father prior to 144 who says, I have the Gospel of Luke and I'm quoting from it. Go ahead.
That section there, 4 through 22, never comes up with Acts.
Good. So your requirement for it to be a quote is for them to say this is a quote?
Yeah. Otherwise, how did you determine it was a quote from a book as opposed to somebody saying something?
Because it's taken directly from the word.
Well, I want you to find me something that is prior to 144 that is taken directly from the Gospel of Luke.
How about Justin Martyr's first apology?
Justin Martyr's writing in the 150s. Good try.
No, he's writing in the 140s, I believe.
You're kind of going too fast for me. Can I make sure I
No,
understand
it's
you?
150s, and roughly 155 is when we have his first apology. As well as dialogue with Tryphos in the 150s. In fact, what you're probably pointing to maybe is like him talking about Jesus sweating drops of blood, maybe? If that's what you were, I applaud you because that's a pretty deep cut, but it's still the 150s.
Let's say I wrote
Interesting.
Yep. The Gospel of Luke is
155.
the Gospel of Luke is not quoted even slightly until the middle of the 150s. There is not a single fucking person who ever mentions it or ever quotes from it prior to 144. It is absolutely using Marcion as its main source.
Ignatius of Antioch does not quote Luke?
Nope. In fact, the person who I was talking to, that fucking Canadian, the person there before, he had actually come up with that question in general because somebody had talked to him on his live about Ignatius, and the only two things that these Christians had brought up, these Catholics had brought up, was that Ignatius had seemed to be pulling from both Matthew and John, but never says anything.
Well, he
about,
certainly
like, the
pulls
gospel.
from Matthew. He certainly pulls from Matthew.
He never says anything about pulling from Matthew. He never says he got it from a gospel or anything. He doesn't actually say the word gospel.
If the point is to quote the thing, the point is that it's already in circulation. So I don't need to say this is a quote from Matthew when I quote Matthew. They just quote Matthew because they know that everybody's going to know what he's talking about.
Cool. Yeah, so the reason why that was a question that was brought up earlier by the guest before you was because he was wondering when Ignatius is actually dated to, and modern scholars actually place Ignatius' death anywhere from about 140 to 160, with M. David Litva here recently actually placing the writings of Ignatius sometime between 165 and 175. We actually pulled that up. Right
Sure.
before
Is that due to the
internal
relation,
content.
internal content, and the relation to this guy, Peregrinus?
No, he does not say that
Proteus?
Peregrinus is Ignatius.
Because things are
So-
out of order.
Oh, I say that, like me and my co-author, we'd say that he's Peregrinus Proteus, who dies in 165. So I would actually date Ignatius' letters a little earlier than that, because obviously you can't write after you're dead. But nevertheless, and David Levitt, literally a Christian scholar, says that Ignatius' writing, or the Ignatius' letters, show up about 165 to 170 or so. But anyways, nevertheless, they literally never say that he's quoting from a gospel or anything like that. And at best, it just says something that's also found in a gospel. That's fine, I guess.
But that's what a quote is. That's what a quote is.
No, a quote is saying I got this from this particular text. Just saying something that's found in another book doesn't mean anything. In fact,
Even if
that's
it's a
what a
direct
quote
quote,
is,
a
then you
direct
have quoted from
correlation.
literally 1,000, probably a million books in your writings and just never known it. That's how that works. Unless you are stating, I got this from this thing, it is not a quote. Or this person said this.
That's not true.
Yeah, that's how that works. Otherwise, in fact,
You're a
you
smart
could
guy,
mean
that's
that.
a poor
No,
argument.
listen.
Well,
You
that
could
seems
mean
correct,
that,
I
but
would
you can't
like it
infer
if
that it's a
you
quote
decide
unless
to
the
do
person
the
says
same
that
route.
it's a
If
quote.
you wrote
What you're doing is
10
you're starting with the
chapters of a book,
presupposition that there is a
you
text
decided to
prior
make
that is
one
the
of those
only
chapters-
possible
one of those
source for that
chapters was
particular
something
thought,
that I had written
which
previously,
doesn't make a lot of
something I
sense.
had wrote
In fact, there's a
previously,
lot of
and
these
decided
things. We
you're
actually
going
had
to
it pulled
put
up
that as chapter
before.
9 of your book.
Is this
And
is this
you
a
said,
thing?
well,
No.
let me take out
So
just a
it is
couple
called
lines from what you
Agrapha.
wrote.
Do you have any idea
Take
what
out
that
a
is?
couple lines
Agrapha?
from it. Chapter
Agrapha?
9 in its
I've
entirety,
never heard that
even though
word.
you took out some
So
of
it is a
it's still gonna
word
be in my style
that
because I
means.
wrote
Here, let me see
what
if I
you
can pull
left,
this up.
right?
Okay. So
Right,
it is a word that is
I
talking
stole-
about
if I
the.
stole-
Is this,
if I stole
that word?
from
No.
you,
Yeah, I gotta give it a second.
it will
Okay,
be,
so
the
it is
story will
a
be
word
written
that
in your
means
style.
sayings of Jesus
What you
that
did-
were
what if
not
you didn't
written.
steal from me, then it
Sayings
would
of
be
Jesus
in
that
your
were not
style,
written.
right?
And what that's talking
Correct.
about is any
Yes,
kind of
so
quote
when we
from a
take
church
Luke
father
7,
or even
4 through
books of the
22
Bible
is not
that
in the
have
style of
these
the rest of
apparent
Luke
quotes from
Acts.
Jesus
It is
that
very clearly
we don't have
not from
anything
that
from.
author.
An
And what
example
that
would be
means
Acts
is
20:35.
that the
Remember
people
the
who
words
were
of Lord
accusing
Jesus,
Marcion of
how he
stealing
said,
from Luke, who
it is more
supposedly
blessed
wrote
thing
all
to
of
give
Luke and all
rather
of
than to
Acts.
receive.
That
This
didn't
isn't a quote
happen.
from Jesus.
And when they
In fact,
tell
other
us
people will
that
literally try to
someone
quote
else, the people
as
who
late
come out with
as
this letter-
Clement of
evangelism,
Alexandria or even
when
Origen
they tell
into
us
the
that
3rd
these
century.
people claim
We
our
have
gospel was
these
first,
random
Luke
quotes
takes
that
from
we don't
us,
have
steals
anything
from
from.
us, and adds
We don't
to
have
it.
any of these texts.
That's how
But
we know that that was the
likewise,
case.
people
It's
can say
not that
things,
hard,
and
Mr.
people can say,
Lodger.
"Oh, hey, I got this from this source," or people can say,
understand
"This
what you're
person
saying.
said this, and we don't
It's
have any source."
interesting you brought
But
up
what
the point
you're doing
that how
is you are actually
it
saying
was disputed
this is
on
a
the
quote,
source of
and they're not
whether
even
Luke stole
saying
from
it's a
the
quote.
Marcionites
We
or
have
if the
people who are
Marcionites
quoting from
stole
books
from
that don't
the
even
Luke.
fucking
trying to
exist
make the claim
and saying
that
it's a quote.
Marcion's
You're
Okay, well, that's a
you're taking
that's
look
a
at something
false
that's not even a
dichotomy.
quote. You-
That's a
where
false
in-
dichotomy.
Where in Ignatius does it say I am quoting
Okay,
this at
now-
all?
Now,
You
here's-
keep
here's
asking for
so
that specific
here's the facts
example.
we have
Nobody
on the
quotes
table.
like
If I
that.
grant you
Nobody
that
quotes
there
like that.
seems to be
No one quotes.
stylistic
No one
changes
says
within
we
the
have
book
the
of Luke
words of
itself.
Jesus.
So there are
No one
stylistic
says
When you're
this?
when you are
across
writing, you
large
don't have to
portions.
quote
Now,
like
the
that.
question
Everybody
is,
knows
Okay.
what you're
is the
talking
best
about.
explanation of those
So,
changes?
What
Is
you're
the
doing
best
is you are
explanation
doing
that
post
someone
hoc
who
rationalization.
from the
You are going in and you were saying
144
this
that
person
stole
meant
it
this when
from-
they
from-
wrote
from later
because
on?
I have
Or
a
is
belief
there a
now
possible
and I'm
explanation that there
changing
were
that
multiple,
retroactively. In
editors
no way,
of
shape,
the
or
book of
form
Luke?
is
You think
it
that
ever
someone
Then during
edited
Jesus'
that
the
that
book of
person is
Luke
quoting. Otherwise, they
changed
would,
enough
early
of
church
it to where
fathers would have
it's
said,
no
"Oh, hey,
longer
Ignatius
the
quoted
rest
from that."
of Luke's
No one ever
style.
claims it.
And it just
Where are
happened
you
to
getting
be
the
the
idea
same
that it
content
would
that
just be
was in
implied
evangelism,
that
and just
Ignatius
happened
was
to be
quoting from
mentioned
Matthew?
by other people, Christian people who hated
Ignatius,
Marcion, that
his letter to the
their side
Romans, his
claimed
He
epistle to the
doesn't say he's
Romans,
quoting unless you
in
can say
chapter
he's
6.
quoting.
Right. And then the
I think
opposite is claimed as well.
that's an
The
interesting
opposite is
line
claimed
to
as well.
hold.
So
Here's-
I don't
here's what's
think
called a dispute.
many scholars would
This is
agree with
something
you
that
that
is
that is a
provided
proper
by,
line to hold in
Stallone.
which you are
Even if
actually
he
quoting
even if he
somebody.
was familiar with it, Ignatius, there's no evidence
You can see that
whatsoever
all
that he
of
was
Acts
writing
comes
prior
up
to
under one
144.
particular branch here. This is like a
Also,
So you would
all
say
of this,
that the
all of
line
this,
from-
all of this is
what this
moot
means is that the
anyways
more that you have
because
to
he
go up
doesn't
the
quote
tree
from
in order
Luke.
to connect
What
to
your
something else,
job
the
was,
less
what your
likely you
task
are
was,
to be
was to
to
try to
the same
find someone
author.
who mentioned
The
Luke or
bulk
even
of
quoted
Luke,
from Luke
which is
prior to
roughly chapters
144.
4 through 22, like
Did
I
you do it?
said, will show up in a complete
I did not do that. No, I did not.
Okay.
So now
if-
answer my question
listen,
on.
hold
No,
up,
stop,
hold up,
stop,
hold
stop.
up,
You-
nope, slow down. Earlier, before we started talking about Luke, what gospel were we talking about?
Separate from Acts and the beginning and end of Luke. Always.
Sorry, John.
It doesn't matter if we chop it
And
into
if
one
John-
chapter at a time,
If
2
John
chapters at
is
a time,
after Luke, as you
3
already
chapters at
admitted,
a time,
and
or
Luke
like
is
we
after
saw,
144,
4 chapters at a time.
is John in the first
Always
century?
comes up separate. The reason for this
I would argue that John
is
is
the fact
written in 70.
that this
Okay.
is
That's
not
what I
Well,
would
that's
argue.
not. That doesn't
So
make any
what you
sense
would have to
because
do
you
is
already
you have to
admitted
explain
that
if this
John
is
is
not
after Luke,
Marcion,
and I just
this
showed
has
you
to
evidence
be
that Luke is after
a
144.
completely
Do you have
different
any
You showed
evidence
me
to
a
suggest that
piece
it's
of
prior to
evidence
Luke?
that might
who very
suggest that
clearly
Luke is
writing this
No.
around
and all of
Do you have
144.
any
That
evidence
is
to
not
suggest?
conclusive
all of
proof.
Do you have
That's
any
not
evidence
conclusive
at
all of it
all
and changed it
that Luke
so
was
much.
written
I don't
prior
have
to
any evidence
144?
right now.
said,
I don't have any evidence right
Did
now.
you have any
Like you said, it
before?
would have to come up as a completely
Before
different
what?
author.
Before this
They changed the
conversation?
words tremendously. Just chapter
Other than the
after
fact
each
that
other
I believe that it was
until
written before
finally the
John.
very
I mean,
end.
you can believe
And I
whatever
believe
you
that
want.
John was written in
It
170.
just
Cool.
happened to
I'm saying
coincide.
that that's my
170?
belief. and
Yeah,
that's all right.
John
Yeah,
was
in
written
70.
around 170. Yeah.
In 70.
This does not
Oh,
include
in
material
70.
This
Yeah, no,
does.
not at
Or
all.
prior
By
to
the way,
around there.
by the way, let me ask you a question.
Happened to be the
Do you
same material
have
that's in Evangeline,
Any
it would happen
mention
to be what
of the gospel?
Irenaeus,
In fact,
Tertullian,
you know what?
and Origen
When's the
say
first
the
person
Marcionites said
to
they had
say the
first,
word gospels?
and someone added to it later? It would
Gospel
be
just means good
mere
news.
coincidence
Cool.
that
When
some
in
editor
relation to
edited
the
a ton
gospels of
Luke
Jesus Christ,
specifically
who's the
on those
first first person to say that? Who's the first person to mention him?
Really, really weird.
I believe it would be Stephen.
Right.
Wouldn't it be Stephen before he gets stoned?
No, we don't have.
He's
any
talking
testimony
about the
from
good
Stephen.
news.
And it's
We know that he gets
explicitly
stoned.
not talking about the gospels that were written. We are explicitly talking
Okay,
about the
so
gospels of
here's-
Jesus
here's
Christ,
a
like the
question for
stories
you.
that were written.
Because a lot of
Matthew,
what
Mark,
you're
Luke, and John.
saying,
Who's the first one
depends
to
on the
even allude
assumption
to their
that
existence?
one author cannot
Allude
use
to the
multiple
existence
different
of the
Matthew, Mark,
Gospels,
Luke, and
quote,
John.
being written down.
Yes.
Matthew,
You
Mark,
think
Luke, and
that
John.
the
Okay,
author
so
I'm
of
guessing
Luke
you have an
started
answer
his
to who the
text-
first person
started
to
his
ever
text-
mention the
define his
word
style.
gospel
Okay.
was. Who is
So
that?
you're about
The
to
first
get
one to even
disconnected
allude
because
to
at this
them.
point you're just grasping for
To
straws.
even allude to these existing.
You are trying to state.
Would you like to know who?
Sure. I would love to know who.
It's Justin Martyr in 155. he mentions the
Okay.
memoirs of the
Changed it.
apostles.
Went
So
back to the original.
what we're talking
and then
about
for
here
all of
is we're
Acts-
So
talking
you,
about
so you just
after
said that John was written
144
in
are
170, and
gospels.
then you're
to make
talking
it
about.
clear,
You just said John was written
what
in
we know is
170,
that
and then you
people
said
like
Justin
Canada
Martyr alluded
do
to that
this.
in 155.
We have
I
J.K.
did not say that
Rowling,
Justin
J.K.
Martyr
Rowling wrote
alluded
Harry
to
Potter.
John.
J.K.
I didn't say
Rowling
anything that
also
sounded like
writes,
it.
You said the Gospels.
Crime
Yeah,
fiction
dude, alluded to
under the
Gospels.
username of-
Prior to Justin Martyr
Yeah,
writing in
username of Robert
155, we would
Completely
have
You said
different,
who is the
like,
listen,
first
genre
person
of
to
book.
allude,
To
to the
allude to
Gospels?
Gospels.
Matthew,
Doesn't
Mark,
use any
Luke,
of
and
the same
John.
words
And
that
you
are
said in
used in the
155, you
wizarding
said it was
world.
Justin Martyr.
I'm trying
When
to
we
tell you
run
what I meant by the word
Stallometry, it
Gospels.
still
Nice try at the
pops up
gotcha,
as
but it's not going to
J.K.
work.
Rowling.
That being said, as far as Justin Martyr goes, when he writes in 155, at that point in time, he would have had Evangeline, he would have had Mark, he would have had Matthew, maybe Luke, maybe, and then also the Gospel of Peter. All four of those were around by the time that Justin Martyr was writing in 155.
So why do you think Marcion is a reliable source?
I didn't say he's a reliable source. When did I say that?
Well, you're quoting him as if he's a reliable source.
When did I quote
Right,
Marcion?
so one author can use.
You're
different
talking about
styles.
all these
You
things
seems
in
like
Luke.
You have to say no to
Okay.
that, and that seems pretty.
I'm just saying that Luke and Marcion are connected because Luke used Marcion. I'm not saying Marcion is a reliable source. In fact, he's writing about Jesus, which means he's writing about bullshit.
One is about
So, I
intention,
mean,
the other one is about
nah,
what
he's not really a
Stallometry
reliable
is.
source in the sense that when he writes these stories, they're still fake stories. It's just a story. And I'm trying to tell you that what you believe and your idea that it's written in the first century is also bullshit, because the people who are trying to hate on Marcion and try to say that he is somebody who is a heretic who stole from them, when it's actually the other way around, they're trying to claim that it's from the first century, and you're eating it up with zero evidence.
Changed his style of writing.
Interesting.
Writing 4 chapters and then went right back.
Why do you put the death of Ignatius of Antioch? This is just something else I was interested in. Why do you put the death of Ignatius of Antioch around what'd you say, 160, 170?
There are historians who have placed it somewhere between 140 to 160. Again, the letters of Ignatius itself or themselves, M. David Litville places about 165 to 170. I would say that Ignatius is Peregrinus Proteus, who dies in 165, but again, I'm not married to that idea. It's you know, it's whatever. It doesn't really matter. The only reason that anybody has any kind of earlier dating around like 108 to 110 is because Eusebius, an admitted liar, writes about that in the early 4th century and says that he died about that time, 108, 110.
Suddenly change it in the same
Eusebius is not the only person who mentions Ignatius' death being around 110.
There's no one who places it in 110 really prior to him. I can't imagine. I can't imagine that at all. Maybe some people said that he died. That's fine. Some people said that he died. I think they said that he was thrown to beasts or something. Is the overall concept of when he how he did his martyrdom. But that being said, doesn't really matter. Literally none of these people are writing prior to 180 or so. I think Irenaeus is really the first one to even quote him, and when he quotes him, he says, "a certain man of ours." See how he actually like tries to quote and says this is a quote? Yeah, that's how people fucking wrote back then. Still today.
Well,
Anyways,
Polycarp
Irenaeus,
in 110 to
even though he
140.
didn't like Peregrinus Proteus, or even if you don't think that that's the case, even if he didn't say his name, he still said this is a quote. Because, and this is true, that's how people quote people. I don't know if you're aware, but whenever you quote someone, you say, this is what somebody said.
It's not.
That's how they work.
So you're saying that the only time that anybody can ever quote somebody or draw up
the only time
the
that you
words
can
that
argue
somebody.
that
No,
it is
let
a
me
quote.
finish what you.
The
have,
only
I've
time
let
that
you finish quite a bit. Let me finish.
The only time
You
you
are
can
saying
say
that
it's a
the only
quote is
person-
when it's a quote. Yes.
So okay, so
The only
It
time
can't
that
be
you can
drawing from
argue
the
that is a
text?
quote. I'm not saying it can't. I am saying that the only time you can use it as an argument to say it is a quote is if you can show that it is a quote, as opposed to just someone talking about the same concept.
okay, so let's drop the word quote and talk about drawing from the text. So
That would still be a
Ignatius
quote.
is
That's what a quote
Jesus
is.
loves you.
You're just defining it. You're just saying,
Love
"Love
your
you,
mom
mom."
and Jesus Christ.
Let her know that
Like,
I'm not going to.
I can't say he's drawing from the text if he's not saying I'm getting this from the text. unless you can show that he is doing that.
That being said,
no,
we're going to go
he
ahead
can
and move
talk
on to
about the
somebody
same
else.
concept.
I will,
You can talk about the
check
Civil
out,
War
let's
all
see
you
here
want.
on
That doesn't mean that you're
Let's see.
quoting that particular book
All
on
right.
the Civil War or that particular
1999.
book.
Thank you very,
You
very
might be
much.
quoting a book. You might be pulling it from knowledge in
1999
general.
from,
Maybe.
Nicholas Tomlin,
You might be making it up.
7753.
But
Says,
if
"Hey,
it's
good
just
stream.
something
So
that
these
is
are all
similar
just
to another book, that doesn't
grasping
mean
at
you're quoting it.
straws.
Paul's
So what this is
self-attestation.
grasping at
Do you
straws.
reject
No,
Caesar?
because
Right,
you haven't
it's
provided any
obvious
evidence
that
for the Gospel of
Ignatius
Luke
is
prior to
talking
144.
about
I don't really have a lot
is
of
talking
knowledge
about
over,
Matthew.
like,
It's obvious that Ignatius is
No.
talking about Matthew and quoting from Matthew.
Sweet. So
when
he
says,
says,
"For what
does he
shall a
say
man
I'm
be
getting it from a
profited
book?
if he gain the whole world?"
Cool.
That's
Does
what
he
he's
say
saying.
I'm
That's
getting it
but
from a
lose his
book?
own soul. That's the direct quote
Does he
from
say I'm
Matthew.
getting it from a book?
He doesn't have to.
Does he say
Because he's drawing from the
as
text.
Matthew says? Does he say that?
in the New Testament that say that they are letters.
Does he
No,
say-
he does not say that.
Okay. Does he say I read this somewhere?
Christian scholars
Because he didn't meet Jesus.
I don't understand this
are actually authentic.
Yeah, I understand
obsession
that you
with
don't
the
understand.
idea that
It's
you
just-
need to
what you're
quote
doing
every
is
time
you
you're talking about
you are
something.
presenting
All the others
apologist
that say
dog
that they're
shit
from Paul
talking
aren't
points.
actually from
You should
Paul.
feel like dog shit for even
So,
bringing them
I
up,
mean,
and you should really feel
it's
like
not that
dog shit
I reject
because of the
Paul's
fact that you're holding
self-attestation.
on to him, even though you know
Christian
that what you're
scholars
doing is
reject
assuming.
Paul's
You're assuming that this is a quote,
self-attestation,
though you don't
or at
have
least
any
the
evidence
author
for it.
that
Just
is
like you
claiming
assumed that Luke was from
So
the,
it's not
and
just
John
me, it's-
was from the
it's
first
just kinda how it
century
works.
when you admitted
So
John was
it-
after
and
Luke,
it's
and
not
you don't have
really
any
that-
evidence that
that's
Luke
how
was
I
even
say,
before
oh,
144.
I think
I
So
showed
when
you
was
evidence that it
Matthew-
was
when
after
was Matthew
144.
didn't exist or something, or
When was
because
Matthew written?
changes of
Matthew was
style or
written
something
as
like
an
that.
as a response
That's not
or a
really it.
refutation
There's a lot
to
more to
Marcion's
that argument
gospel.
than just that.
Marcion's gospel
But
says that
it's
Jesus
not
was the
just me that
Son
rejects
of
it.
God the Father, a previously
And as
unknown
far as
God
we don't
separate from
just- I'm not
Yahweh,
just saying,
and
okay,
Jesus
Caesar-
descended down
I'm not saying
to
Caesar existed because
earth
we have his writings.
as a fully grown man.
If
starts a
you
lot
want
of
to
different
make the same
institutions like
argument
the Lord's
for
Supper or
Caesar
Eucharist or whatever,
based
and like
off
the
of,
concept of healing and
Caesar's
philosophy and bullshit like that.
self-attestation or lack
And then he
thereof,
dies
or
not to
rejection of it.
not to die for the sins of
Okay,
humanity,
but
but to
we have
purchase
things
humanity's souls
outside
away from
of
Yahweh,
Caesar's
putting us
supposed
under a
letters
new covenant
to
or a new
prove that he
testament.
existed.
He's the
We
first one to
don't
even
have
use
that
the
with
phrase
Paul.
New
That's
Testament
the
for
problem.
a canon.
Yeah, the things we
That
have
being said,
for
whenever
Caesar
Matthew comes
is
around,
one,
Matthew
it's
is
gonna be
written
the two
as a
books that
way
he
to
wrote.
actually
One
bypass
is
God the
about
Father,
his war
to
in
say that
Gaul, to say
Jesus
he's
is
gonna be about
directly
the Civil
connected
War.
with
We
Yahweh,
have letters,
and say
that
that he is a
Cicero
Christ.
kept.
It has the
So we
birth
have
story.
the
It tries to say that
letters,
he is actually
we have
born
a
here. He's
history
from
that's
the line
being
of David in
written.
some
We
weird
have-
way,
I'm
shape, or
trying to remember
form.
the name of
Even
the
though
guy,
Matthew
but
skips
he,
over generations in his
wrote.
genealogy
He
and
would
includes
listen to
someone who's
Caesar
cursed.
speak,
But the point
and he'd
is,
write down what
and goes to
Caesar
Joseph,
was
so it doesn't
saying.
matter anyways.
We
But
have,
the point is,
sculptures
Matthew is a
that are
refutation
made
to the
by
material that is found in
different,
Evangelion. The
sculptors,
Q source, are
and
you
they
familiar with
all
what the Q
look
source is?
pretty dang close.
I think I've heard of
Caesar
it,
was
but I don't know
standing in
off the top of my
front
head.
them.
Are you
So
familiar
all
with the
of
concept
these
of synoptic
contemporary
gospels?
evidences
Yes.
give
Okay. So
credibility.
whenever
that
we
the
take a
books
look
that
at the two
Caesar
source
attests to
hypothesis,
himself, says,
we're
I
actually going to
wrote
pull this
these,
up here.
gives those more
This
credence
is
that he actually did
absolutely.
write them.
Okay,
Again,
this
there's
is
outside
the
information for them.
This is the image that I
Let's
want
see.
to pull
What
up
about
here.
Socrates?
Okay,
Socrates doesn't write
two source
anything, so,
hypothesis. This is the
I'm
common,
gonna reject
most
anything,
by far
written by
the
Socrates,
most
who did
popular
write it.
theory of
And
how
then
these
let's see,
gospels
who forged
come
7
to be.
letters with
All right,
embarrassing
it
details?
is the two source hypothesis. The
Marcionites, I
purple
guess. I mean,
material.
to some extent,
Oh, the purple
what
color
you're
there
doing is you're taking a
indicates
look at
material that is
canonical
found in
versions.
Mark,
Canonical
Matthew, and
versions
Luke.
include
The
certain
dark
things,
blue is material that is found in
are
Matthew and
added
Luke, but
later
not
after
in
the
Mark.
Marcionites
And then
published
the
these
green
texts.
and the
The
teal are
Marcionite
things
texts
that
do
are
not include these embarrassing
exclusive to
things
Matthew and
necessarily.
Luke,
These are
respectively.
things that are added
The
later
reason
to make
for
Paul more
this, the
subservient
reason
to
for this
the
hypothesis
disciples.
is because
Like
information that is found in
John
Matthew and
Baptist
Luke
connect
would
to,
likely
for,
come from some other source other than
apostolic
Mark,
lineage, where the
because
Roman Catholics
where
and the
else
Roman
would they
Catholics.
get
That sect of
information that
Christianity,
they're so
took
closely
a
aligned
look
with that Mark
at,
doesn't have?
uh,
This
that-
hypothesis has been
that sect of
suggested for a
Christianity took a
very
look at
long
Paul's letters
time.
and said, hey,
Q, which is
let's
short
try
for
to make
quell,
this guy,
German for
let's
the
take
word
him down a
source,
peg,
is a
let's try
hypothetical
to more or
document that
less
we
make him
don't
into a
have,
Marcionite
that people
to some extent,
say, oh,
and
this is what it looks like, or this is what it would look like, blah, 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 blah. They all agree that there's sections of Matthew and Luke that come from some other source, right? They're never going to fucking find it because they're looking in the first fucking century. It's not going to be there. Q is Evangeline. That is the gospel from Marcion.
No, it's not that they're
Mark
bad.
and Luke,
It's just that-
Matthew and Luke both
just that they're
pull from that
outdated.
particular
I mean,
gospel. There's also,
I don't-
just in case you want
I'm
Well,
not
what's
saying
what's
that
the
the
evidence for
claim
Q
that
being
sun went
the
around
God
the
of
earth. I'm not
being
saying that
evangelion?
Yeah, that's what we're going to do.
people,
Have you ever
or
heard of
even
the
if they were
concept
really
of
stupid.
Matthean
It's just that
posteriority?
They were wrong. And
I can guess what that is, but
Okay, what is
I
it?
mean, Mark in priority, Matthew posteriority, as in written last.
Sorta, yeah. Of the three canonical gospels, it
Sure.
is the concept that Mark came first, and that material went into Luke, and then you have Matthew over here. All right, so this is just kind of a graph that shows it. It's something that some scholars hold to, but it's obviously not the most common. The most common is going to be your two-source hypothesis, but it actually kind of works with it. So let me explain. So one of the reasons for this, when we take a look at some of the evidence, this is one of the most damning pieces of evidence, and if you consider what I'm about to tell you, it will absolutely blow your fucking mind and show you exactly why it would come after Marcion. So Matthew contains passages that are conflations of elements drawn from Mark and Luke. There are 6 different verses that do this. This phenomenon is unique to Matthew, for there is no similar array of passages in Luke that are composed of elements drawn from Mark and Matthew. Let me explain. In just to give you an example of like one of these situations, Mark in one particular story of the gospel says that Jesus says the workers are plenty, but the harvest is plenty, but the workers are few. All right. And then in Luke, in a completely different part of the story, not connected to that story at all, not even the timing's off, everything like that. It's a completely different story, but it's still in Luke's gospel. It has Jesus saying, or it says that Jesus looked upon the disciples as if they were sheep without a shepherd. All right, completely different, unrelated stories. But then Matthew goes and puts those stories or those lines together in the same story. It says that Jesus looked upon the disciples as a sheep without a shepherd, and he said to them, "The harvest is plenty, but the workers are few." This happens 6 times. It is taking from a verse in Luke and a verse in Mark that are unrelated and putting them together. Whereas this never happens anywhere else. So what they're saying is that these are scholars that are saying that Matthew must have had some kind of a early draft of Luke or Luke itself in front of him, which is why they hold to Matthean posteriority. Matthew must have come after Luke.
Can I ask a question about this before you continue? Just a quick question. So you're saying that it is not good to say that, or you are not allowed to say that when Ignatius says in his letter to the Romans, I'm not allowed to say that it's a quote, right? So how are you allowed to say that? I'm not just curious, how are you allowed to say that that's a direct quote and you're stealing that from those gospels when he could just be talking about the same thing?
He could be talking about the same thing. It's the fact that when they're talking about these things is explicitly the point. It matters when they're talking about it. That's what I'm talking about. If it doesn't have to say it's a quote. In fact, if you want to argue that he is not quoting them, perfectly fine. But they're still talking about that information at this particular point in time. That's the issue. I am not opposed to the idea that Ignatius, if you were to somehow date him to the first half of the 2nd century, which I don't think you can anyways, but even if you did, I'm not opposed to the idea of somebody talking about somebody early in the 2nd century or early to mid-2nd century, when Ignatius is supposedly writing, just talking about these concepts, just talking about him. Talking about him doesn't mean you're quoting it. That doesn't mean that you're getting it from that book. That's what I'm saying. But it does mean that someone at that point in time was talking about it. That's all that it means. And so in this particular case, whenever they have Matthew talking about elements that are found in Mark and Luke, even if he's not directly quoting them, what he's doing is at least giving us this information, and he's giving this information in a weird way, because he's taking information that was just kind of talked about here, or Mark decides to put into this story, or Luke decides to put into this story. Matthew decides to write it down in a way that is unknown. It's a completely separate, unique way of doing it. All right.
I guess coloring that by saying, well, he's doing this in a weird way. I don't know that you can do that, and be.
I mean, he is.
Consistent.
He's putting it in a unique way because
weird
Mark
from your
puts it in one.
perspective.
No, it's unique. That's what I said.
Sure, unique. Well, you said weird, but unique.
Well, it's
yes,
still
it's
weird considering the fact
two.
that he's the only one who does it.
Hopefully you enjoyed it. If you have any questions or anything like that,
Sure.
reach out.
Yeah, and it's unique in the sense that it's, again, unique to him. It literally says in this particular passage here, it says, or in this particular section here on Wikipedia, it says, this phenomenon is unique to Matthew. There is no similar array of passages in Luke that are composed of elements drawn from Mark and Matthew. Now, I'd like to point out at this point in time that every single one of these particular passages where Matthew does this, every single one of them, when he draws from Mark, it draws from Mark. Or when he's talking about something that is in Mark, it's just in Mark. But all the verses or all of the things that are talked about, even if it's not a direct quote, all of the concepts, whenever we look at things found in Luke, are found also in Evangeline. In fact, all the verses that people point to when they say that Luke has to come after Matthew are verses in Luke that are not part of Evangelion. All of the material that people point to, every single verse that people point to in Luke, to say this verse right here shows that it comes after Matthew, they are pointing to verses that are not found in Evangelion. In every single instance right here, in this text right here where it says that it's conflating Mark and Luke, whenever it does that, every single verse here in Luke, every single verse is actually found in Evangelion, which would mean that if Matthew has a version of Evangelion in front of him, he is actually pulling from Luke,
are you familiar
or what
with
the scholars
the
are calling
word
Luke,
interpolation?
because Luke pulls from Evangelion, and then the Gospel of Luke comes after Matthew.
All right.
It goes.
What if we
Mark,
were to tell you that
Matthew,
when we take a
Luke.
look at
Just like
Tacitus
everyone else
and
says,
Josephus, we know definitively
but around the
that
time of
somebody
Mark
added
is
to
Evangelion.
these texts?
Evangelion is the Q source. Matthew pulls from the Q source. It pulls from Evangelion and tries to refute it.
Yeah. What
It
if I
has
was to
Jesus
tell
saying,
you
"I did
that
not come to
when we're
abolish the
taking a
law.
look at
I came to
antiquity,
fulfill the law."
term Christ,
So it's literally going
Christos, or
against Marcionite
Christus,
theology.
does not refer
Luke
to like
straight
an
up takes
individual,
Evangelion and
that
adds
it is
to it
a
in order to
title
attempt to change its
that is
theology.
given to something
Jesus
that
is
is
not
anointed
from
with
some other
oil.
god. Jesus is directly foretold by prophets in the Old Testament. He's connected a little bit more with John the Baptist in Luke. He's got a slightly different ending there in Luke as well.
Christos
And it's published as the
used
Gospel of
over
Luke.
39 times
Then, as you said,
in the
John has to
Septuagint
follow
in
suit, or
reference
John has to
to
follow
high
after that.
priests and kings.
John is later.
In the Septuagint.
Mark, Matthew, Luke, John, and Evangelion is around the time of Mark.
Yeah, so we agree it's a title. It's not his name, right?
Yeah.
Okay.
Interesting. I still
So
don't.
what if I was to
I
point
don't
out
understand
that every
the
historian
connection
that
with
you're going to mention either is
with
being
Evangelion.
interpolated into, meaning somebody's adding to it.
I don't know
I
what
don't
you
know
mean by
Ones
that.
never
What are you-
say
I
the
don't know
name
what you
What are
mean
you
by
trying to
that.
get?
Don't. They always
What are you
use
trying to
the
get
Like-
to?
term
Like, what do you not understand?
I don't know
That
if you
it's just a
explained that in the
title,
but
that
like
it's
can you
not a
explain that
reference
one
to
more time?
Jesus.
Again, for what? What connection?
Like you're saying that like
can
what
be,
that
but it's
Mark or that
not.
Matthew is
I
taking
mean, the
from
queef's just in the
Matthew
pudding.
is
Evangelion?
Matthew is pulling stories from there, but it's not a direct quotation.
Huh?
Like which person?
Sorry,
can-
so he's taking from Evangelion. Is what
Yeah,
you're
he's
saying.
taking
like
stories
Pliny
from
the
it. He's
Younger.
taking stories from it, and he's changing
Pliny the
things.
Younger.
He's influenced by
mentions that they
Marcion's
worship
Evangelion, and he's trying to refute it.
a Christ
Luke is straight up
as
just
God.
copying it,
But
and then just making
Christ, if
slight
it's something
edits,
that's just anointed,
and then
it
adds
could
something to
be
the beginning
a
and something to the end.
person that is like, for example,
Like
when we found
Matthew is like
the
a
mystery cult
refutation of it.
Dionysus
It's
in
got the
Pompeii,
material in
we
it,
found
but
an
it's not
area
word for word.
that
Luke is
appears
word
to
for
have
word
had a
of Evangelion.
person standing there, or possibly an
100%
item
of
was
Evangelion
placed
is
there.
found in the Gospel
And
of
this
Luke.
individual probably was
Slight-
a
it just- things are
representation
added to it.
of Bacchus, of Dionysus. So that would be the
Interesting.
Christ. They were probably being anointed with oil.
I've never seen someone so talk about Marcion so much. I think he's an interesting guy. So this is really interesting. I've never seen someone talk about
I mean, you can
Evangelion
say
or
if there's
Marcion so much.
Christians worshiping
Marcion is
Um,
someone who is
something that
popping
gets
up a
anointed
lot
with
more within
oil.
scholarship on the New Testament, much, obviously recent scholarship
no.
on it,
Jesus
because
anointed
we're
with
starting to
oil?
find out that the
When?
New Testament is written in the 2nd century.
When?
You have not only
by who?
Marcion is the
By,
first to publish the
when
New
he was
Testament
baptized.
canon in 144.
Did that person have
And
the
the only
authority to anoint
the
him?
only reason
according to the
that
Bible,
people
it
have
does.
not really
Who
looked
does the
too terribly
anointing?
much into
Jesus.
him is
does
because
the
there's been this
anointings?
weird compromise between non-Christian
I think
scholars
it's
and Christian
priests.
scholars who really want the
Priests,
text
yeah,
to be
was it
early,
priests who
and
anointed
non-Christian
them?
scholars are like, we'll grant you like the end of the 1st century, that kind of thing.
No?
There's been
Oh,
so
what-
many
what
years,
prophet
so many
anointed
decades,
him?
so many centuries that we have said that the
John the
New
Baptist
Testament
is
is
according to,
written
like,
in the
John the
1st
Baptist
century.
didn't anoint
So
him,
we
John the
don't even
Baptist
consider
baptized him.
Marcion. There are
Yeah,
three
anointing.
people. The three
Well,
people who
it's the
talk
same
about him the
thing.
most. There's not the only mentions of them, but the three people who talk about him
Baptism
the
and
most:
anointing are
Irenaeus,
not the same
Tertullian,
thing.
and
Like,
Origen.
let's queef it
From
real,
180
okay?
to 240, they talk
No,
so
like,
much
it's
shit
the
about
same
this guy
procedure to,
that the
like,
Christians
to
today
elevate someone,
and scholars
to
today
recognize,
just assume
religious
that he's
sense.
just a non-starter. He's just some loser who shows up
No.
later. But the fact that he is the first one to publish a New Testament canon, and the fact that we are slowly starting to realize that we don't have jack fucking shit before him on Jesus or Paul
No, what I'm
or
saying
any
is
of the
that
Gospels
Christ
or
doesn't
anything from the New
refer
Testament.
to Jesus, it's just a title. You
It
admitted
is
that as
it
much
is
at
starting to
beginning.
highlight
It's just a
Marcion
title.
Yeah, a
as the
title that
start
can mean Christ.
of the, at the very least,
Christ means
the
Christ,
text for
Mhm.
this text-based
I'm
religion.
saying oh my bad. A title
I am
that
not
can
saying that he starts
refer to
Christianity.
Jesus.
Christianity existed prior.
Okay, can refer to
We
servants,
have
too.
elements of
What is the evidence
Christianity
that referred to Jesus?
going back to the 1st century
Because
BCE.
Tacitus says Christians followed
But
Christus. Christians
I am
don't
saying that
follow
the
whoever
the
you just said
first
right
person to publish
know?
a story about this mythology of Jesus
now.
and
'Cause
this
it's
concept of
mentioned
Paul
in the
is
context of
Marcion
Christians.
in 144.
Christ in the context of Christians is Jesus.
No, Christ
I mean,
is
there is a
Jesus.
Marcionite canon.
We don't have any
Uh,
stories about
it's,
Jesus.
I mean, obviously
We don't have
rejected
any stories about
um,
I mean, it's just
by
Evangeline
the
and
Orthodox Church.
It's just Evangeline and 9 or 10
So
books
you're
written in the
saying
style of
that
letters attributed to Paul. That's all
I'm
it is.
saying that there is a
evidence is
religion
too late.
of a Christian.
Well,
There's
technically, I
evidence of
guess you could
Christian.
also say Antitheses.
Christians
Antitheses is a
are
book that he comes out with
religion
that
or a mystery
just
cult
explains his
that have been
theology.
around.
I agree.
It's actually mentioned in
Been
1
around
Timothy,
for
by the
quite
way.
some time that
1 Timothy
followed
says to
a
avoid
deity that
antitheses
they
and
knew as
Gnosticism.
Christ. That does
which is
not
second century.
automatically mean that there's
Says
a
that
man
in the
named
Greek.
Jesus that's involved in the story.
Interesting.
But
Yep.
I'm asking.
But
you're
those are
saying
first
that
or
evidence
pastorals, and pastorals
is
weren't
too
even
late?
included in Marcion's
No, what I'm
thing.
saying
Like I
is
said, he
the
had 9 or
evidence
10,
for
depending
Jesus
on whether or not he had
Christian
Philemon. He may have had
activities
Philemon, may not
is
have.
3
But the
decades after
pastorals, the
Pliny.
other 3 of the 13 that say that they're from Paul
don't
in
have
the
any-
New
we don't
Testament
have
today,
any evidence.
those
We
are
don't have any
after that.
evidence that the
I mean, we
Christians
already
gave
know
connection
that
to
that's
it
not
was
from
some guy
Paul.
named Jesus
But
who
considering the fact that
worshiped a
Marcion
man
produces
until
9 or
after
10
Pliny.
that do not include the pastorals, and then the pastorals
I don't have a problem
mention
with that, because-
antitheses
Okay. Well,
and
then what is
Gnosticism,
your evidence
we
No,
can
no,
see
no,
that the
I'm just saying,
pastorals
for
are
example-
absolutely in the 2nd century.
For example,
Hell, 2 Timothy mentions
and
Polycarp,
compare him to other
his Latin name
historical
Carpus,
figures.
Cool.
and
All right,
Uh,
so
his
what is
scribe
your
Crescens.
evidence
Julius
that Pliny
Caesar.
is talking about Jesus if Jesus does
Who
not
dies in
exist
180.
for another 30 years after Pliny?
So yeah,
Because he's talking
the
about
New Testament's 2nd century,
Christians.
man.
Okay,
And in the
and
context
Christians
I don't know what to tell
don't
you.
have to apply.
Christ means Jesus.
No,
It's interesting.
We don't have any evidence of Jesus.
I'll look into
meaning
this some more.
Christ meaning
This is
Jesus
a really,
for the
I
Christians
think this is a
for
productive
years.
conversation for me.
Yeah, Jesus is a Jewish name.
Yeah, you're an interesting guy. I like to talk
It's a
with you.
Greek name.
Your name's Jaaron.
What I'm saying is
Jaaron.
Yep.
Christ is the
J
title.
E
Wait,
R R
you
A
realize
N.
You realize
well,
Jesus
look,
is the
Is that
It's
right?
written on the front of the book.
English
You can
version of
check it out.
right?
The
I'll look
ebook
up
is
the
just
book.
the ebook is just $3,
Translator.
man. It's not like it's super expensive or anything.
Yeah.
It's $3.
So
It's me
again,
and my Dave
so
Science co-partner,
here's your
or
evidence.
my co-author. We take a look at the New Testament. We take a look at the Codex Sinaiticus, the Codex Vaticanus. We chop it up into chapters, compare it against itself, and compare it to get anything we can get our hands on in Greek from the 1st, 2nd, 3rd century, as well as some of the 4th century CE and the 1st century BC.
Can go to
And we try to see
Suetonius.
when
Well,
it
we're
was
talking about
written.
Pliny.
And if we can
Well,
try to
Suetonius
find
is
out
later
who
and
wrote
also
it,
doesn't say the
we
name
can dive into that. We use a
Let me-
myriad
let
of
me
different
pull
ways
up
to
some
do this.
evidence. Just give me
One
a
of the
minute.
ways that we analyze a text is using stilometry. It's a peer-reviewed and accepted form of literary analysis which
I
seeks to
mean,
attribute
what we
authorship.
get while you're
And
looking
we
that
see
up,
that the
what
New
we
Testament,
get
again, is
that
written
they
in the
meet
2nd
before
century.
dawn on a
And in
fixed
some
day to
cases,
sing
we're able
hymns
to, like
to
with
Christ
Luke
is
and
God,
Marcion,
stuff
we're
like
able
that.
to
What
identify
we
some
don't
authorship
get is
of
that
at
he's
least
born
some
in
of it.
Judea, that he's the queen of peace,
Sure. So
that he was baptized.
just before I
we get none of this.
quit out
Mhm.
and let somebody else come in, why would you say that so many scholars believe that Jesus and Paul existed?
I would say that, well, the majority of scholars
In
that are in the field of religion,
Shivering cold.
the majority of them have some kind of religious leanings somehow. But there are plenty of non-religious, personally religious scholars that say that Jesus existed. Some of them, like Bart Ehrman, say he definitely existed. But the reason for this, in many cases, most of them just say he probably existed, likely existed, or don't have a problem with it. But the reason, like someone like Bart Ehrman says he definitely existed, is because they're relying on church history to, or they're
No,
putting a
what
really
we're
high,
talking about
fairly arbitrary
is-
level of
so he
reliability
mentions at the
on
very
church
beginning
fathers
of
and
the
church
letter,
history,
he's writing to
when I'm
Trajan
just not going
because
to
he
do
doesn't
that
know what
just
to do with these
because
Christians. He
I'm
doesn't
going to
know what
ask,
to do with
okay,
them.
what evidence
He's
do we
like,
have? What does
I
the
have no
internal
idea who these
critique
individuals
actually
are,
say?
but
What does the content of
problem
these
is
writings
he
say?
served
What-
under 3 emperors
when can
as
we
a
actually
warrior. He's
nail down these things?
governor at
Luke
this
and
time.
Acts
He's referred
are,
to as
if you check out our book,
Trajan's
Luke and
secondus,
Acts,
so he's the second
that's
in
our like
command.
anchor, if you will, for the
And
New
the
Testament.
fact that he has no
because
idea who these Christians are,
I am just as
is
sure
kind of
that
problematic.
Luke and
But he
Acts
says,
are written in the
"But
middle of the
I
2nd century
know they
as I
are
am that I'm talking to you
religious."
on
And
TikTok
how do
right
I
now.
know they're
right?
religious?
Because there's a
They're doing these
myriad of
things
different
they're
ways that
reading
we
on a
can
fixed
nail it
day, they
down to this
sing
time period.
hymns.
So we just kind of
there's
use
this
that
Christ
as
thing that
an
they're
idea as
looking
to
to
how can we pull
as
the rest of
God.
it to that? Can we use that as a time
They're doing
frame
these
or a
things.
point of reference
And so
for the
because
rest of the
I
New Testament?
recognize that this
And
is a
similarly, we can
religious
do this
thing,
for this for
and I
like the church
presented
fathers
them
and stuff. We
a
can try to figure
picture
out
of
whether or not
you,
what they're saying
just
is
to make
legit,
sure that they're going to
or
follow
whether or
the
not it's written at
religious
this
laws.
time or this time.
And
that
when
kind of
they
thing.
or
But
those that
let me give an
refuse to
example.
bow
Bart
to me,
Ehrman,
I tortured,
exact example.
and
Bart
we
Ehrman, and I'm
punished
quoting
them.
from him.
They got
So
punished
he
under
talks
the law.
from
There's nothing
he
here
talks about
about like Christianity
Jesus.
specifically.
Sorry, he
He's
talks about
pointing
Paul,
out things that
and
were
he says
common
Paul
for
met
most
James,
mystery
the brother
cults
of
of the
Jesus.
time period.
And to quote Bart Ehrman,
Yeah,
he
but
said,
also mentioned such as the
"You
amount we're
can't
taking,
have a brother
regular Roman
and not
festivals, like,
exist."
let's go sacrifice to
And that
this
makes
god.
sense.
That's the reason
It
he's
does.
writing the
And
letter.
people eat it all up.
Yeah, other
Guess
people
what?
wouldn't.
No one outside of
Yeah,
Christianity
if
even
you
mentions
weren't
Paul.
part of the Roman
No one mentions
cult, or
Paul
you're
till
part
about
of a
144.
religion that
And on top of
necessarily
that,
didn't
when we
do
reconstruct what
sacrifices,
Paul's
you
letters
wouldn't
had
do
in it, when
those.
Marcion
It's just
produces it or
mentioning
publishes it in 144, you can
the,
read all the different reconstructions that we have of
things
it.
that religious
They
cults do
don't
at the time.
mention meeting James. That is something that we see is added later in the
To
second
your
century.
response
It
that
is not
this does
something
not mean
they
Jesus.
never straight up
From-
mention
okay,
it.
from
They
Pliny the
it straight up
Younger, we
never
can
mentions
infer-
James, the
we
brother
can
of
infer
Jesus,
that
in
he's
the
talking
first
about
iterations of
Christians,
Paul's letters.
one.
So unless you can
He's talking
show
about
that there's some
Christians
version of Paul's
worshiping
letters
this
that existed before
figure known
Marcion
as
that
Christ,
had James in it,
right?
the oldest
And
version of
under
Paul's
his
letters that we have
context, right?
are from
What
Marcion
Tacitus
in
knows, what does
144.
Christ mean?
Probably not from Paul at
according
all.
to what
That doesn't really make a lot of
Tacitus would
sense anyways. We
recognize
can get into
Christ
that if you
to
really want to,
mean.
but probably not. But the point is,
The
144,
English one, I think. I'm not sure.
Yeah, we talked.
these
that
versions
this
don't
is
say
a
shit about
title,
that. But that
and
is
we do
Bart
know
Ehrman's gotcha.
that during
That
when
is his
mystery cults
strongest
would
argument.
meet,
And
they
it's
would have
gone.
either
And
a
he relies
person
entirely
or a
on the church in order to
item
make it.
that would
Well,
represent the
I
deity,
think
and they
Bart
would
Ehrman is
usually
not a
be quite
particularly
foil. That was just part
persuasive
of it.
individual from either end of the spectrum, either way.
Well, I'm just
Um,
kind of letting you know why people say that.
Sure,
Because some
sure.
people will follow in lockstep with him.
No,
So
you're
that's why
presupposing
scholars
that.
Yeah, I
will
don't think that's a
generally
good
say
idea.
Your
that Paul
Christian
existed or
ideology,
that Jesus
you-
existed.
you
They'll
say
say
it
these things
has to
because
be
they, well,
Jesus.
take
I'm
what
saying that when
the
Pliny
early church
is
said
writing
is,
this,
for lack of a better term,
he's
In
not
111?
presupposing it. In
Bart
111.
Ehrman is also the person that says that Jesus never claimed to be God, which I think from the text is completely ridiculous thing to claim.
I think, especially in John, it's pretty obvious that there was a connection there between the Jesus character and
Huh?
the Yahweh character, obviously.
No.
But yeah.
When they meet
And
Christ,
then
meaning
just
early
one,
Christians,
sorry,
or
take
when
up your
the
time.
Christians
One
were
more thing.
identified,
Just about
meaning
when
Jesus.
would you date,
Pliny wasn't Christian.
I guess,
Yes, I
the
agree.
Jesus figure
Mention
as
Christ,
coming about?
Yeah.
which is the
with
identifying
Marcion.
name for
You,
Christians.
you could
Who they
say
worship.
he's the first one to publish it. You could
Right.
say
Yeah.
that
Doesn't mean
someone
Jesus.
was talking about it
Next-
prior or
next
something like
point.
that.
Yeah,
I
Christ
guess.
means Jesus.
No, it does not.
But
With Jesus at all?
yeah,
Okay,
I'd
Jesus
say
is
that
At
the
Marcion?
name, right?
Yeah, because
And
no
we
one,
don't see
no
the name
one,
Jesus associated with
no one
the
mentions them
Christ
prior to
until
Marcion.
144.
We just don't
Well,
have it.
that's not true. Pliny the Younger's letter to the Emperor Trajan in 117 directly quotes that that Christians, first of all, are existing, and not only that they're existing, but they're worshiping
Yes, we don't
Jesus
have a problem with
as
that.
a god.
Okay.
So that comes in
And I guess
117.
that
It's a
Christ is
direct
Jesus.
letter,
Do you have any
and then
other
Trajan
evidence?
replies to
Okay.
Pliny the Younger in that letter.
Either
So
provide
I think
evidence
that obviously it comes
the
before
word Jesus is
Marcion in
associated with
140.
Christ in
4,
111
whatever you
or
said.
It doesn't say
or you will
Jesus
be
and it doesn't say a God. It
Now at
says
this point.
they sing a
Do it. I'm just
hymn
saying,
antiphonally to
nope,
Christ
provide
as God.
evidence
A
that the
is
word
a
Jesus is
that's an
associated with
article,
Christ
and
in
Latin doesn't have
111 or
articles.
144.
The word a is put in there
But
by
that's-
Christians
it's
who
a-
translate
it's a-
that and try to assume that
flawed
Christ is meaning
criteria.
Jesus, who
Okay.
was a person, so therefore it
I
would
was
need
gonna
to
help
be
him. I was gonna give
separate
him the
from
book of
God. What it's
Clephysis.
saying there is, at best, that Christ is their deity. Christ is a title. It means anointed, and it was applied to a whole bunch of different deities and people prior to
Yes.
even the Christians coming around, that
This
kind of
right
thing.
here.
In fact, I would say that who he's probably
I
talking
made
about
that.
is,
Yeah,
yes, the
this
Christians,
right
but the
here.
deity that they worship is Christ. That's
This
why my book,
is
me and my co-author's book, it's called
a-
Christ Before
a-
Jesus.
a-
It's because we acknowledge that Christians did exist going back as early as about the 1st century BCE or so,
This right
but they worshipped a Christ deity as opposed to
incredibly valuable.
Jesus. Jesus is a mythology that they end up
Yes.
with,
Purchase
thanks to
it.
Marcion, in
The
the
right.
140s. But the deity who they're
tell
probably
you
worshiping, if you're wondering that, is
for
probably
the love
Serapis.
of God,
Serapis
man,
was
stop using the word
known
queen.
as a Christ and was worshipped in Sinope. Asia Minor, where Sinope is the
Where
largest city
Marcion
in
comes from.
Pliny's. Yeah, that's where Marcion comes from. It's also the largest city in Pliny's region. Also, I'd like to say that in 300 BCE, Ptolemy the First, Soter, and you can look this up.
$5.
Don't let me blow smoke up your ass. Look it up.
Chat over there on YouTube
He brought down a
says,
statue of
"Skip the
Serapis
oven,
from
this is not gonna
Sinope
end well."
down to Alexandria
Skip the oven.
in 300 BCE
Feel the
in order to
spasm.
bridge the gap between Greek and Egyptian religions.
Just
They immediately
add
started
air
worshiping it
and
down in
enthusiasm.
Alexandria. Later on, in the 20s, roughly 20 or
Fluffy
so,
joy.
we have
in
Philo
every
of
spoon,
Alexandria writing a book called On the Contemplative
One bite,
Life.
and you're
And in this
over the
book, he
moon.
writes about the Therapeutai, a group that lives around Lake Merotis in Alexandria. And they have
real quick, you
these
did
rituals
name
that
for
are
the love
very
of
similar
queef,
to what
right?
Pliny talks about as far as the Christians in 111 or early 112.
And then he left.
Point is, they
And
have a
then
connection
Cyber
with
was no more.
Serapis, according to an
Serapis and
inscription on the Greek island of Delos.
$2.
And on top of that, Epiphanius and Eusebius in the
From
4th
World Cup.
century, Christian historians, say that the Therapeutai were the first Christian monks. Which doesn't make sense
Interesting.
because they date prior to the supposed ministry of
10
Jesus.
points to House
Eusebius
Ash.
and Epiphanius just flubbed it. They just completely fucked up. But they did see the
Getting
connection
song is
between these
so
things. Yep.
Interesting.
let's
Alrighty.
see.
Well,
Period,
I'm sorry, there's a big vacuum in the background.
And
Yeah. So yeah, I would say that what Pliny is running into is a group that probably worships Serapis or is connected to some extent to Serapis at some point in time. And in the 130s, there's a supposed letter from Emperor Hadrian down to his friend in Alexandria that says the Christians in Alexandria worship Serapis. A bishop of Christ is none other than a bishop of Serapis. This is found in the book Historia Augusta from the 4th century.
Sure, and then Pliny talking about the way that these Christians lived. You say that that wouldn't be evidence of them following Jesus' teaching, but it would be evidence of
No, it's
Serapin?
very similar to the way that the Therapeutai are mentioned. The Therapeutai are mentioned as people who get together once a week and they have like a meal and shit like that, and they live in like communes. They like share up shit. As far as the Christians are mentioned there, it says that they get together, they have a meal on a fixed day, and then they sing a hymn antiphonally to Christ as God.
a lot of the
Yeah.
claims from these historians,
As-
or a lot of the
yeah,
claims
like
that
they're
these
God.
historians like
Yep.
Tacitus or Josephus wrote these things.
Sure.
But
Alright.
yeah, I would say that
These are things that
that's
they're getting
that's him
wrong.
running
You can
into
tell
Christians.
now it's
At
not
this
the
point in
case
time, I'd like
based
to
off
let you know
of,
that
more
at
information
this
that
point in
we
time in
find
111,
or about these people or about the context of what they're
all
talking about,
of according to
or just
you know
literary
according to
analysis
what
of
you were
the
saying
text
earlier,
itself.
all of the New
On top
Testament
of
should have been
that,
written and disseminated.
they're just
How
kind of
he
assuming
doesn't
that
get the
church
name
fathers
Jesus
are
after
correct when
like
talking
torturing
about
some of
certain
these people
things.
and
Like, for
unfortunately
instance,
unaliving
Bart
some of these
Ehrman
people is
is
beyond me.
believed
He doesn't mention
atheistic,
anything from the New
or
Testament.
agnostic,
Literally doesn't mention the name
scholar that
Jesus.
says that
Doesn't
Jesus,
mention
has to
Jerusalem,
be
any
existed.
connection to Judea, any connection to
his
Judaism.
kind of
Doesn't mention the
big
Fiscus
gotcha is they
Judaicus, which was a
hasten the
tax
whole
levied against the
reputation
Jewish
of sleep
people,
or whatever.
specifically
Is the
for this
idea that
purpose of
Paul
like
met
not
James,
worshiping the
brother of
Roman
Jesus,
gods and
and to
stuff.
quote Bart Ehrman, you can't have a
He
brother
doesn't
and
mention
not exist, which makes
virgin
sense.
birth, crucifixion,
But
nothing.
the problem is,
And this is one of the
there is
longer
no mention
letters
of
that he
Paul outside of
writes.
Christianity ever. There's
And
no
when
mention
Emperor
of Paul in the
Hadrian
first century,
writes,
nothing within
no,
Pauline letters.
Emperor
Trajan.
when Trajan writes back, Trajan says, he just says, hey, you're doing the right thing, you know, you just kind of keep it going there, but they're not to be hunted down. Like they're not trying to stamp out Christianity or anything like that. They just see it as kind of weird.
Well, I mean, they are torturing these people and executing them.
Well,
if
he's
they
doing that
don't
because they
repent.
broke the law, which is you have to worship the Roman emperor. And he writes to the
Sure.
emperor and he says a true Christian, it says, cannot do that. Like a true Christian that is said cannot worship you or whatever. He's writing as if he has no idea who they are, and he was the second most powerful man in Rome. He's literally called my secondus by Emperor Trajan. It
Well,
seems
I mean,
weird that he wouldn't know this and kind of
Christianity in the early 100s wouldn't be a large group of people. It would be a small sect,
Well,
a
it
small
was big enough
Jewish
in the
sect.
60s. No, it it's big enough in the 60s that Nero could tell the difference between a Christian and a Jewish person, and that is about 50 years prior. So, no, and there's no
Big
evidence
enough
whatsoever to
to-
suggest that Christianity comes from Judaism. It's more of something from like Greco-Egyptian religion that is in that area to some extent. So especially post-Bar Kokhba revolt, you would get more Jewish mixing.
There's no evidence to suggest that Christianity comes from Judaism.
Correct. Yep. We don't get the stories that connect anything with Judaism whatsoever until post-Bar Kokhba revolt, which is when Emperor Hadrian banishes the Jewish people from Judea and they go into the surrounding areas. And it's at that point that about a decade later we get the first gospel that places Jesus in that
because you're
area.
saying these gospels are placed later. Okay.
Yeah, he places them in that area, but Marcion is straight up saying Yahweh fucking sucks. So like,
I didn't know that. Wow.
it's
that makes sense. So do you think
it might even be
they're
anti-Semitic.
relying on
The first
purpose? Is that
first
the-
gospel. It's just that the later gospels
church
are
fathers.
more
Church
leaning
fathers.
towards that Jewish thought and more connected with it. There's not really any evidence that it's coming from Jewish people per se, but it's coming from second century people who are definitely more familiar with Judaism because of that diaspora out of Judea in the 130s.
So would you argue that figures like Peter and the rest of the disciples didn't exist as well?
So, in short, yes. Longer answer, there's a slight chance, I would grant a slight chance to the inner circle being real people who existed in the evolution of Christianity, just not like actual disciples. Like Peter, James, and John, I don't really have a problem with them being people who existed, who were part of like different like church leaders or something like that. But I mean, to say, obviously I wouldn't say that they're disciples of Jesus, but we don't have any mention outside of Christianity once in antiquity of any of the disciples. So the evidence is obviously not good at all, but I don't really have a problem with maybe the first three because they seem to be the people who they connect to as much as possible with apostolic lineage and stuff. They try to say, oh, hey, we're going to appeal to this guy, we're going to appeal to this guy. I would assume that that's just like a prominent leader that they just kind of worked into the story somehow. And
I guess I'm curious that you're not more like staunch that they didn't exist, because I feel like the evidence for them
one more thing
existing is
I feel like I know
drawn
what
directly from the evidence
What do you
or the
think
so-called
about the
evidence
Shroud
that
of
Jesus
Turin? For me, that is
existed.
still kind
So
of
I guess I'm
surprising
curious as to why you're not
interesting thing to look
as hard on that. I mean, they don't matter as much as Jesus, obviously. So
Didn't they say like they were testing the fibers?
like
Also,
to the
okay,
grand
that's-
scheme of things, but
yeah, I mean,
I guess
just
that's why
being
you're like
people
it's
who
possible,
are
but
part of it. I mean, it doesn't really mean much, but I would still say no. I would still say no, they didn't exist. We don't have any evidence for them, and yeah, but we don't have a lot of. I mean, the way that they're depicted in the New Testament definitely didn't exist. Definitely not. I mean, not at all. But to say that they were people who were just involved, especially maybe John, I'd be quicker to say John than anybody else because John supposedly is alive around like the beginning of the turn of the second century there. And so I don't think he's a disciple at all. I think he's just somebody who people sort of kind of knew, somebody who was involved with Christianity. But still, it's definitely not good evidence at all, especially not the John of the New Testament. He didn't exist. I can definitely say
Even
that.
if we levitated,
I mean,
look weird.
because the New Testament
I've
tries to
heard
say
people
that this
say that
guy's
he
like
levitated.
writing shit, and it doesn't make any sense because it also says in Acts 4:13 that he's illiterate. So, and I don't know why he would be writing things in the language that doesn't even speak.
This right here is the mask of Agamemnon.
Interesting. Well, thank you for your time. That was a interesting conversation. I might pick up your book. Yeah, give that a read.
Check it out. Let me know what you think. At the very least, you can check it out, and for $3 there, the links in the bio or on YouTube profile there. You can check it out, and it'll be a kind of a cheat sheet to knowing what I'm about to say. So you can come up here and be like, oh, hey, here's where I argue, here's where I disagree, and you're already knowing what my argument's going to be. My argument's going to be.
Sure, I'll be looking. I'm going to look some more into Marcion. I've never given Marcion much thought.
He's coming back.
Just because his beliefs are so. I mean,
yeah.
the two gods is
Yeah.
is definitely
Yeah.
definitely a bit too much.
Yeah, I mean it's different, but I would say that this is because. Oh, and by the way, that other god, Tertullian has a
Funny,
whole
okay, right.
like couple
Okay, cool. So,
paragraphs
but it
about
is true that like
how
this
that
kind of work, it's
God
not been replicated.
that
Or is it
Marcion
hard for them to
believes is
replicate it?
God the Father. He keeps calling him the unknown God, the unknown God, the
Around
unknown
the
God.
same
Yes.
Okay,
When
but around
Ptolemy
that
brings down the
era where it
statue
was made, is that kind of
of
there wasn't any
Serapis
kind of art
from
like this,
Sinope,
right? I guess that's stupid because I don't
later
some
hometown
scientists
of
have taken a look
Marcion,
at it
much
and
later, but
determined
still
that it's just
that area.
red paint,
When he brings it down to
anyway.
Alexandria,
In fact,
people said, "Why did you do
it's
this?"
using a bas relief,
And he
most likely,
says,
which is kind of like
"It's because I
have you
had
ever
a
seen, like,
dream
side of,
from
like,
the unknown God."
buildings and stuff like that, or like ancient style looking, ancient
Right.
looking kind of buildings, where it's like almost like
So,
the image kind of pops.
I don't know. I don't see the.
It's the fact that this is absolutely something that is connected to some extent with
You know what I'm talking about?
a mystery cult that had been around for quite some time.
Yeah.
Marcion's
So
gospel
it's that
is
kind of thing. It's using a
weird
bas relief for
to
this,
you
and they're going over it
and
with
to
probably
everybody
blood.
because
Well, I
it
would
is
say
a
blood,
it
or
is
it would
very
be
clearly
probably
different
used blood
from
because
where
they
the
obviously think
proto-Catholics
Jesus
took
was
it.
covered in
The
blood,
proto-Catholics
so
is
why
what
wouldn't they
my
use blood for
co-author
this
and I
artwork?
what we
So
call
they
like
used that, and
what
then they used
the
an
sect
oven
of
to make
Christianity
it
that
look,
would that gives us the Gospels
ancient
or it gives us
or,
the
like,
canon that we have today
aged.
to some extent.
And
And it kind of picks these things out. Like
the
Irenaeus,
first
we
time
would
that
call
we
a
get anybody
proto-Catholic.
writing about
They're
it
not
is in the
really called
1300s,
Catholics at that point in
and most
time,
people who are
obviously,
writing about it at that
but
point are saying that
nevertheless,
it's
they're
fake.
the sect that would eventually
Only once it
become
became popular
like
and moved to
more
tour
like the
in
Catholic
Italy did
branch
the
and whatnot.
Catholics actually say that
But
it
my
was
point
real.
is,
And then the 1988
prior to
study
them,
came out and said it was actually
we have
propagated from
Evangeline, and it's
1300s, which
weird
makes fucking sense.
because it's like
That's when the
your
Catholic
missing
Church
link.
actually reversed their decision or
It's
their stance on it and
Lucy.
said, nah,
It is
not
the
real
missing
anymore. So
link
they'll actually
between
stop short,
proto-Catholicism,
saying it's
which
real.
we're more familiar with,
So,
that kind of
yeah,
concept,
only like some
and this
conservative
mystery
Catholics
cult,
or
if you
Christians who
will.
really get big old boners for seeing some
It
dead
doesn't
guy.
make a lot of sense
They're
because it's right there in the
only
middle.
ones who are really saying that Jesus is actually depicted in the
So what is? Where does the connect? You're saying that the connection to,
I like talking about
like
this,
the
but
idea
people
that these,
talk
I
about
guess
this
you would
are
call them proto-Catholics,
weird or, like,
are saying
uninteresting.
Yahweh
Normal dude.
and God the Father. They're connecting that
Okay.
after the fact, and they're trying to like
weird.
add in this Jewish connection that doesn't exist.
They want to eliminate the concept of this other God completely and focus more on connecting Jesus with Yahweh directly.
It's true.
As opposed to going to God the Father, they're just going to go directly to Yahweh.
What's he talking about?
And it makes sense that the proto-Catholics
talking
would be the
about?
ones that would grow the most and be the most popular and last the longest and everything, outlast everyone else, all the other sects of Christianity. Because if you are a sect that ties in closer to Judaism, which at the time was about 10% of the Roman Empire and definitely a lot of people in that area, then you're gonna grow faster. The staying power of Christianity is there because of the fact that it's very pliable. Jesus can really be whatever the fuck you want him to be. Republicans use him today to say that he would have been somebody who was fighting for his people first, that kind of thing. Then you have more liberal ass hippies who are just like out there saying, "Oh, Jesus was all about peace and love and radical feminism." He calls a woman a dog, but whatever. The point is, at a certain point, you got to realize that these stories can be all things to all people, and so it helps to have your foot in the door. Oh, you have a god that like Dionysus that changes water to wine. So do we. Oh, your god Serapis he heals people, and
Interesting.
he
That's how
even
you would
like
put
we
those
have
stories as their connections.
we have say what?
So that's how you'd say that those miracles are trying to connect as much as possible to these other.
I mean, to some
figures at
extent,
the
it's like a
time?
trope. It's just a trope, but it's just the fact that like you can use this as a way to get in. It's not even what I'm saying. It's what even Justin Martyr was saying. Justin Martyr lamented the fact that if you preach Jesus to the cult of Asclepius, and I've got a book here from Asclepius, is massive. This is every mention of Asclepius that we have from history. And in this text, we have multiple lines from like Justin Martyr and people in the 2nd century who are saying, hey, there's this cult of Asclepius, and when we approach them, they're basically like, oh yeah, we already worship a healer god. He's like Asclepius, and they don't like that, but they tell you how to approach them because it's a foot in the door. You have something that's very similar.
Interesting.
Yeah. So now, I, as far as the actual supernatural things and the claims there in the New Testament stuff, I'm not saying that they are like like I'm not like a zeitgeist type, like obviously zeitgeist is like that video that came out in the early 2000s is saying like Jesus is just Horus or Jesus is just myth. No, what I'm saying is that those would be tropes. Like if I told you to come up with a superhero, you would come up with things that we all think about superheroes having. That's not saying that like you are copying somebody. That's just what a superhero is. Like, it's a trope. If you're coming up with a god back then, you'd come up with gods who do certain things because of godlike abilities, like resurrecting or walking on water or changing water to wine or controlling the weather or like Zeus literally is like throwing lightning bolts and controlling the weather, and Poseidon controls the weather, and no one blinks an eye when it says that Jesus is able to control the storm. That's really weird. But obviously I don't talk a lot about the supernatural stuff, but you can clearly tell that it's like a trope. It's like a genre, if you will.
Well, I mean, his disciples definitely did not bat an eye when he said they were terrified, right? So it's not that they didn't bat an eye; it's just that they kind of saw that and then saw his power. Either way, whatever. But yeah, fascinating stuff. I'll take a look into more of that, into more of Marcion, and some of that stuff. This is a fun conversation.
Yep. Well, that's why I do it every day, every weekday.
All right.